Hey everyone. So what you should be doing first, if you haven't done so already, is watching this video right here, which you can get to on the Moodle under videos for chapter 9. So watch that video, and as you're watching that video, you should be indicating the various types of evidence presented in the video that help support the theory of evolution by natural selection. All right. So if you want to pause, go ahead and then come on back to finish up the rest of this. All right, this video hopefully will be fairly short here. So I want to focus in on one piece of evidence presented in the video that's kind of important when we think about the diversity of organisms on our planet, but also the fact that we have many organisms that are quite similar in design, sort of, but actually have entirely different ancestors. And so I want to talk about how that comes about. So the idea of comparative anatomy is pretty straightforward, I think, right? That organisms, comparative anatomy is the comparison of body structures of different species of animals. And there's kind of two different ways of describing structures that might be similar between two different species. And the terms that we use are what we call homologous structures, all right, which is what the image is showing down here, which I'll get to in a sec. And we have what are called analogous structures. So what's the difference between the two? Well, homologous structures are very similar in their embryonic origin, all right? So they are similar in embryonic origin. And thus give rise to similar bone structure. But they have a different function, So let's look at this group of organisms over here. We have lots of different species, human, horse, whale, right? But if we compare the limbs of all these animals, we can see some very similar bones. And in fact, they're even given the same names. The upper arm bone, right, is the humerus. So we can see that in the human. We can see the humerus in the horse, right? And as we move down, right, you've got the lower arm bones, the radius and the ulna, right? And we can see those in these different organisms, from the human to the horse to the whale, all the way up to, well, not shown here, but anyhow, there's a bird over here. We've got radius and ulna, etc. So the fact that they've got this very similar structure indicates that they have a common ancestor. But what's interesting about them is they're all slightly different because they serve a different purpose. They have a different function, right? We can think of the arm of a human, we might use for various various chores, various tasks, right? Grabbing, hanging onto, holding, right? We don't typically use it for support, but if we look at the horse, how it's modified, rather than having digits, it's modified its digits into a single hoof, right? And all that is creating, and we've got thicker, maybe more dense bones. If you look here, the radius and ulna are fused together, providing a greater support because our radius and ulna are important to help sort of twist our arm around, whereas the horse doesn't do that. If we look at the fin of the whale, the upper arm bones are more condensed, but then the lower digits, they elongate, kind of wrapping or extending out so that the fin can wrap around there for a larger surface area, right? Versus ours. So they all have these slight differences to them based on their function. But what it tells us is the similarity in the bone structure and the parts tell us that there's a common ancestor. On the converse side is analogous structures, and here they're very different in structure, so different in design, right? Different in design, which is indicative of the fact that they don't have a common ancestor, so no common ancestor. But they are similar in function. So we can look at all these different winged animals, right? So here, I haven't really looked at all this, but this looks like a bat. This here is probably a bird of some type. And then here we have an insect. And so if we look at the interior structures, each one is quite different, right? This one is different than this one is different than this one. And so, what that shows is different ancestors. But they've all evolved something similar because of the environment that they occupy. Similar in design, or similar in function, sorry, for flight, similar in function because similar environments. It's a great example of how evolution can produce the same trait or characteristic because of natural selection and the environment selecting for something that works. So even though they've got entirely different ancestors, they've all evolved from a different background and developed wings for flight. So it brings into question sort of two ways in which evolution can occur. Evolution can occur by what we call convergent or divergent means. And so when we talk about divergent, right? So here we're talking about common ancestor, right? Common ancestor that leads to two different species, species one, species two. So we're creating diversity here, right? Different species, right? But the common ancestor leads to homologous structures. And this is what we call divergent, right? This would be divergent evolution. Right? In which a common ancestor produces species that are similar in design but may carry out all kinds of different things based on the environment that they're in, whether they're in water, on land, in the air, and so on and so forth. But divergent evolution because they're diverging from a common ancestor. On the other side, we've got convergent, which here we would have species 1, species 2, and they have totally different ancestors, right? Different ancestor. But we're not saying that they come together as one species, but they become more alike. They become more alike, producing analogous structures due to similar environments. Sorry, I'm blending things in together here, but so they become more alike. They're still different species, right? The insect can't interbreed with the bird, or the bird can't interbreed with the bat. So we've got different species, but evolving in a very similar way because of similar environments. Again, it's just another great example to show how nature is selecting for specific traits, and those traits can arise from all different kinds of organisms. It doesn't have to be a single ancestor that will always be creating this diversity, right? Or similarities that we see. So that's it. I just want you to make sure that you print off that peppered moth case study. And I want you to think of two things here to bring to discussion tomorrow in class. We're going to talk about this peppered moth case study. And if you remember our antibiotics discussion at the start in terms of the magazine article that I brought in. So if you want to have another quick read over that and the peppered moth case study, we're going to be discussing those in class tomorrow. Have a good night. See you Friday.